New Brunswick is one of Canada's 3 maritime provinces and is the only constitutionally bilingual province. It was created as a result of the partitioning of the British colony of Nova Scotia in 1784. Fredericton is the capital, Moncton is the largest metropolitan area, and St. John is the most populous city. In the 2011 nationwide census, Statistics Canada estimated the provincial population to have been 751,171. The majority of the population is English-speaking, but there is also a large francophone minority, chiefly of Acadian origin. The flag features a ship superimposed on a yellow background with a yellow lion above it. Etymology: the province is named for the city of Braunschweig, known in English as Brunswick, located in modern-day Lower Saxony in northern Germany. The then colony was named in 1784 to honor the reigning British monarch, George III. Braunschweig is the ancestral home of the British monarch George I and his successors. History: the original First Nations inhabitants of New Brunswick were members of 3 distinct tribes. The largest tribe was the Mi'kmaq, and they occupied the eastern and coastal areas of the province. They were responsible for the Augustan Mound, a burial ground built about 800 BC, near Metipnakik. The western portion of the province was the traditional home of the Wolastoqiyik people. The smaller Passamaquoddy tribe occupied lands in the southwest of the province. French colonial era. Although it is possible that Vikings may have reached as far south as New Brunswick, the first known European exploration of New Brunswick was that of French explorer Jacques Cartier in 1534, who discovered and named the Bay of Chaleur. The next French contact was in 1604, when a party led by Pierre Duguay de Mons and Samuel de Champlain set up camp for the winter on St. Croix Island, between New Brunswick and Maine. The colony relocated the following year across the Bay of Fundy to Port Royal, Nova Scotia. Over the next 150 years, a number of other French settlements and seigneuries were founded in the area occupied by present-day New Brunswick, including along the St. John River, the upper Bay of Fundy region, in the Tantramar marshes at Beaubassin, and finally at St. Pierre. The whole maritime region was at that time claimed by France and was designated as the colony of Acadia. One of the provisions of the Treaty of Utrecht of 1713 was the surrender of Peninsula Nova Scotia to the British. The bulk of the Acadian population thus found themselves residing in the new British colony of Nova Scotia. The remainder of Acadia was only lightly populated and purely defended. The Maliseet, from their headquarters at Meductic on the St. John River, participated in numerous raids and battles against New England during Father Rale's War and King William's War. During Father Le Loutre's War, in 1750, to protect their territorial interests in what remained of Acadia, France built 3 forts along the frontier with Nova Scotia. Was also built on Isle Royal after Queen Anne's War, but the function of this fort was mostly to defend the approaches to the colony of Canada, not Acadia. During the French and Indian War, the British completed their conquest of Acadia and extended their control to include all of New Brunswick. Fort Beauséjour, Fort Menegusha and Fort Gaspereau were captured by a British force commanded by Lt. Col. Robert Monckton in 1755. Inside Fort Beauséjour, the British forces found not only French regular troops, but also Acadian irregulars. Governor Charles Lawrence of Nova Scotia used the discovery of Acadian civilians helping in the defense of the fort as a pretext to order the expulsion of the Acadian population from Nova Scotia. The Acadians of the recently captured Beaubassin and Petit Kodiak regions were included in the expulsion order. Some of the Acadians in the Petit Kodiak and Memramcook region escaped, and under the leadership of Joseph Broussard continued to conduct guerrilla action against the British forces for a couple of years. Other actions in the war included British expeditions up the St. John River in the St. John River Campaign. Fort Anne fell during the 1759 campaign, and following this, all of present-day New Brunswick came under British control. British colonial era. After the 7 Years' War, most of present-day New Brunswick were absorbed into the colony of Nova Scotia and designated as Sunbury County. New Brunswick's relatively isolated location on the Bay of Fundy, away from the Atlantic coastline proper, tended to discourage settlement during the post-war period. There were exceptions, however, such as the coming of New England planters to the Sackville region and the arrival of Pennsylvania Dutch settlers in Moncton in 1766. In both these cases, many of the new settlers took up land that had originally belonged to displaced Acadians before the deportation. There were several actions on New Brunswick soil during the American Revolutionary War: the Margoville Rebellion, the Battle of Fort Cumberland, the Siege of St. John, and the Battle at Miramichi. The Battle of Fort Cumberland was the largest and most significant of these conflicts. Following the war, significant population growth finally came to the area, when 14,000 refugee Loyalists, having lost the war, came from the newly created United States, arriving on the St. John River in 1783. Influential Loyalists such as Harvard-educated Edward Winslow saw themselves as the natural leaders of their community and that they should be recognized for their rank and that their loyalty deserved special compensation. However, they were not appreciated by the pre-Loyalist population in Nova Scotia. As Colonel Thomas Dundas wrote from St. John, the Loyalists have experienced every possible injury from the old inhabitants of Nova Scotia. Therefore, 55 prominent merchants and professionals petitioned for 5,000-acre grants each. Winslow pressed for the creation of a Loyalist colony, an asylum that could become the envy of the American states. Nova Scotia was therefore partitioned. In 1784, Britain split the colony of Nova Scotia into 3 separate colonies: New Brunswick, Cape Breton Island, and present-day Peninsula Nova Scotia, in addition to the adjacent colonies of St. John's Island and Newfoundland. The colony of New Brunswick was created on August 16, 1784. Sir Thomas Carleton was appointed as Lieutenant Governor in 1784, and in 1785 a new assembly was established with the first elections. The new colony was almost called New Ireland after a failed attempt to establish a colony of that name in Maine during the war. The province later gained control over its crown lands in 1837. Even though the bulk of the Loyalist population was located in Partown, the decision was made by the colonial authorities to place the new colonial capital at St. Anne's Point, about 150 kilometers up the St. John River, as it was felt that by placing the capital inland, it would be less vulnerable to American attack. The University of New Brunswick was founded at Fredericton at the same time, making it the oldest English-language university in Canada and the first public university in North America. Initial Loyalist population growth in the new colony extended along the Fundy coastline from St. Andrews to St. Martin's and up the Kennebeckasis and lower St. John River valleys. During the late 18th and early 19th centuries, some of the deported Acadians from Nova Scotia found their way back to Acadie, where they settled mostly along the eastern and northern shores of the new colony of New Brunswick. Here, they lived in relative isolation. Additional immigration to New Brunswick in the early part of the 19th century was from Scotland, Western England, and Waterford, Ireland, often after first having come through Newfoundland. A large influx of settlers arrived in New Brunswick after 1845 from Ireland as a result of the potato famine. Many of these people settled in St. John or Chatham. Both St. John and the Miramichi region remain largely Irish today. The northwestern border between Maine and New Brunswick had not been clearly defined by the Treaty of Paris that had ended the American Revolution. By the late 1830s, Population growth and competing lumber interests in the upper St. John River Valley created the need for a definite boundary in the area. During the winter of 1838–39, the situation quickly deteriorated, with both Maine and New Brunswick calling out their respective militias. The Aroostook War was bloodless, and the boundary was subsequently settled by the Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842. Throughout the mid-19th century, shipbuilding on the Bay of Fundy shore and also on the Petit Kodiak River and rivers on the east coast became a dominant industry in New Brunswick. The Marco Polo, the fastest clipper ship ever built, was launched from St. John in 1851. Resource-based industries such as logging and farming were also important components of the New Brunswick economy during this time, and railways were constructed throughout the province to serve them and link the rural communities. Canadian province New Brunswick, one of the 4 original provinces of Canada, entered the Canadian Confederation on July 1, 1867. The Charlottetown Conference of 1864, which ultimately led to the Confederation movement, originally had been intended to discuss only a maritime union, but concerns over the American Civil War as well as Fenian activity along the border led to an interest in expanding the scope of the proposed union. This interest in an expanded union arose from the province of Canada, and a request was made by the Canadian political leaders to the organizers of the Maritime Conference to have the meeting agenda altered. Although the maritime leaders were swayed by the arguments of the Canadians, many ordinary residents of the Maritimes wanted no part of this larger confederation for fear that their interests and concerns would be ignored in a wider national union. Many politicians who supported Confederation, such as Sir Samuel Leonard Tilley, found themselves without a seat after the next election. Nevertheless, backers of the wider Confederation eventually prevailed. Following Confederation, the fears of the anti-Confederates were proven correct as new national policies and trade barriers were soon adopted by the central government, thus disrupting the historic trading relationship between the maritime provinces and New England. The situation in New Brunswick was exacerbated by both the Great Fire of 1877 in St. John and the decline of the wooden shipbuilding industry. Skilled workers were thus forced to move to other parts of Canada or to the United States to seek employment. As the 20th century dawned, however, the province's economy again began to expand. Manufacturing gained strength with the construction of textile mills such as the St. Croix cotton mill, and in the crucial forestry sector, the sawmills that had dotted inland sections of the province gave way to larger pulp and paper mills. The railway industry, meanwhile, provided for growth and prosperity in the Moncton region. Nevertheless, unemployment remained high throughout the province, and the Great Depression brought another setback. 2 influential families, the Irvings and the McCains, emerged from the Depression to begin to modernize and vertically integrate the provincial economy, especially in the vital forestry, food processing, and energy sectors. In the mid-1960s, forestry practices changed from the controlled harvests of a commodity to the cultivation of the forests. New Brunswick changed from more than 2/3 rural before 1941 to predominantly urban by 1971. Education and healthcare were poorly funded, and in the 1940s and 1950s the rates of illiteracy and infant mortality were among the highest in Canada. During the period 1950 to 1980, 80% of New Brunswick's small farms disappeared, as the agro-industry took root. The Acadians in northern New Brunswick had long been geographically and linguistically isolated from the more numerous English speakers, who lived in the south of the province. Government services were often not available in French, and the infrastructure in predominantly francophone areas was noticeably less developed than in the rest of the province. This changed with the election of Premier Louis Robichaud in 1960. He embarked on the ambitious Equal Opportunity Plan, in which education, rural road maintenance, and healthcare fell under the sole jurisdiction of a provincial government that insisted on equal coverage throughout the province. County councils were abolished, and the rural areas came under direct provincial jurisdiction. The 1969 Official Languages Act made French an official language. Geography. New Brunswick is bordered on the north by Quebec's Gaspé Peninsula and by Chaleur Bay. The eastern boundary is formed by the Gulf of St. Lawrence and Northumberland Strait. The southeast corner of the province is connected to the Nova Scotia Peninsula by the narrow Isthmus of Chignecto. The south of the province is bounded by the Bay of Fundy coast, has amongst the highest tides in the world. The U.S. state of Maine forms the western boundary. New Brunswick differs from the other maritime provinces physiographically, climatologically, and ethnoculturally. Both Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island are either surrounded by, or are almost completely surrounded by water. Oceanic effects therefore tend to define their climate, economy, and culture. On the other hand, New Brunswick, although having a significant seacoast, is sheltered from the Atlantic Ocean proper and has a large interior that is removed from oceanic influences. As a result, the climate tends to be more continental in character rather than maritime. The major river systems of the province include the St. Croix River, St. John River, Kennebeckasis River, Petite Kodiak River, Magaguadavic River, Miramichi River, Nepisiguit River, and the Restigouche River. Although smaller, the Botucha River, Richabukto River, and Cotchaborwak River are also important. The settlement patterns and the economy of New Brunswick are based more on the province's river systems than its seacoasts. Because of this, New Brunswick's population centers tend to be less centralized than in Prince Edward Island and Nova Scotia. Fredericton, St. John, and Moncton all sit on rivers that have played a significant role in their economic history. Northern New Brunswick is dominated by the Appalachian Mountains within the eastern Canadian Forest ecoregion, with the northwestern part of the province consisting of the remote and rugged Miramichi Highlands as well as the Chaleur Uplands and the Notre Dame Mountains, with a maximum elevation at Mount Carlton of 817 meters. The New Brunswick lowlands form the eastern and central portions of the province and are part of the Gulf of St. Lawrence lowland forest ecoregion. Finally, the Caledonia Highlands and St. Croix Highlands extend along the Bay of Fundy coast, reaching elevations of more than 400 meters. The total land and water area of the province is 72,908 square kilometers, over 80% of which is forested. Agricultural lands are found mostly in the upper St. John River Valley, with lesser amounts of farmland in the southeast of the province, especially in the Kennebeckasis and Petite Kodiak River valleys. The three major urban centers are all in the southern third of the province. Climate. New Brunswick has a humid continental climate all over the province, with slightly milder winters on the Atlantic coastline. The far north of the province is just above subarctic with very cold winters. Winters are colder than those being found in Nova Scotia all over the province due to the greater continental influence. Summers are often warm, sometimes hot. Demography. Ethnicity. First Nations in New Brunswick include the Mi'kmaq and Maliseet. The first European settlers, the Acadians, are today descendants of survivors of the Great Expulsion, which drove thousands of French residents into exile in North America, Britain, and France for refusing to take an oath of allegiance to King George III during the 7 Years' War. Acadians who were deported to Louisiana are often referred to as Cajuns in English. Much of the English-Canadian population of New Brunswick is descended from Loyalists who fled the American Revolution, including a considerable number of Black Loyalists. This is commemorated in the province's motto, Spem Reduxit. There is also a significant population with Irish ancestry, especially in St. John and the Miramichi Valley. People of Scottish descent are scattered throughout the province, with higher concentrations in the Miramichi and in Campbellton. In the 2001 Canadian census, The most commonly reported ethnicities were 193,470 French, 165,235 English, 135,835 Irish, 127,635 Scottish, 27,490 German, 26,220 Acadians, 23,815 North American Indian, 17,024 Asian Canadian, 13,355 Dutch, and 7,620 Welsh. It should be noted that 242,220 people identified themselves as simply Canadian or Canadians, while 173,585 also selected another ethnicity, for a total of 415,810 calling themselves Canadian. Population since 1851 languages. The 2011 Canadian census showed a population of 751,171. Of the 731,855 single responses to the census question concerning mother tongue, the most commonly reported languages were New Brunswick's official languages are shown in bold. Figures shown are for the number of single language responses and the percentage of total single language responses. During the 19th century, Scottish Gaelic was also spoken in the Campbelltown and Dalhousie area. The language died out as a natively spoken language in the province in the early 20th century. Religion. The largest denominations by number of adherents according to the 2011 National Household Survey were the Roman Catholic Church, with 366,000, Baptists, with 70,990, the United Church of Canada, with 54,265, the Anglicans, with 51,365, the Pentecostals with 18,435.